All right, so let's start. I'm going to jump into Wikipedia here. I love Wikipedia. I am a good old-fashioned nerd, okay? I started making web servers and web pages, and I didn't make web servers. I fiddled with web servers, and I made web pages way back in 1993 when I was an undergraduate student at Mississippi State in the physics department. And one of my physics professors came back from CERN, which if you've read, oh gosh, Da Vinci Code. No, that's not it. Whichever of the Dan Brown books has Antimatter and the Pope. I read it. It was very strange. The movie was at least entertaining. At any rate, CERN was the home of the World Wide Web. It's a particle physics research community. I would say it's more than a facility in Switzerland. And my professor came back and he had heard about this thing called World Wide Web. And here you can see it's got no spaces in it. That was the actual name of the program that this guy, Tim Berners-Lee, computer scientist, made specifically so that they could allow for hypertexting, which is when you make a link, like all the things on this page. And it was a very complicated process. Oh, and I'll also point out here, he used something called a Next computer. Here, let's open that in a new tab. Next is actually its own really interesting story. Yeah, okay, thank you, Jimmy Wales. Always an appeal. The Next computer, interestingly enough, is the home that Steve Jobs found after he was run out of Apple. And he ended up making Next into quite a formidable computer company. Now, they weren't sitting on your home, office desk or anything like that, but Next is famous for being the computing platform that the World Wide Web was developed on. You can actually see here's the first World Wide Web server. It was actually Tim Berners-Lee, his workstation, and they still have it there. I'm going to show you another picture of that in a minute. But anyway, it's interesting that the Next computer system has a connection to Apple and Steve Jobs and the video game Doom. If you've ever played that game, I have. Like I said, I'm a nerd. Very, very nerdy. Anyway, so I wanted to point out that the web, which started in 1993, and here you can see the three kind of architects of the computer science behind the web, including Tim Berners-Lee, who has since been knighted. He's from London, and he's now Sir Tim Berners-Lee. The web is much newer than the internet itself. The internet is literally just the connectivity of networks together, and that started in the 60s. Part of the DARPA one of the DARPA projects that the United States federal government essentially said, dear world, we want this to exist and we'll help you do this. In the end, we get to keep some of the technology and you get to keep some of the technology. And of course, I'm simplifying it, but the interesting thing about the way DARPA set up the development of the internet is it was essentially allowed to live on its own, to have its own sort of ecosystem. And the web grew up in that sort of mentality, and that's why the web is free. Tim Berners-Lee and the other architects wanted to design a piece of the internet that allowed for graphical display of information, that allowed for hyperlinking, and that would be free for the world to use. And that was a conscious decision that Tim Berners-Lee and his cohorts made way back when they were developing the hardware, the software, including the servers and the browsers, which is a word that didn't exist before then. Very, very briefly here, I've got a couple of chunks of pretty nerdy looking stuff. You can see this thing called Git and this thing right here, HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. That's technically what a web server is running. That's the software it's running, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And that's why you'll notice at the front of a URL, Chrome doesn't actually require them, but here I'll add it in. http://. You've probably seen these characters and maybe didn't know what they meant. It's a way of indicating that I'm not just using the internet, I'm specifically using the web as part of the internet. If the internet is just a connection of networks, then the web is software that sits on top of that. And your browser actually speaks web, which is why the HTTP is there. The : by the way, that's a throwback to the internet's early days. And the : which we'll talk more about when we talk about links, has to do with which type of thing we're using on the internet, in this case the web. Okay, enough of that. I'm just going to talk about Mosaic very briefly, because when my professor, Dr. Croft, came back from CERN in 1993, my physics professor, and I set up the website for physics way back then, I had to use this browser here called Mosaic, and it was very, very clunky. And this is a screenshot of, maybe not of the first one, but of a very early version of Mosaic, and it just didn't work very well. It was very, very cool because it had graphical elements on the internet. Before this, everything was text. Green text on a black background, or some combination, amber text on a black background. Yeah, so Mosaic is the browser that really started it all. So the reason why things are the way they are with browsers is this guy right here, Mark Andreessen, who not only worked on Mosaic early on, but he decided he was going to make himself rich by making Netscape. And Netscape, which later became Firefox, or I guess it became Mozilla first and then Firefox. I mean, it's got the history of Firefox through Mozilla through Netscape goes all the way back to Mosaic. So this is a very old sort of idea, not just when you think about Chrome and Safari and Internet Explorer. All of these browsers really kind of have their history all the way back in Mosaic. Um, I have a picture of Tim Berners-Lee here because I'm very fond of this guy. He's very, very nerdy. He has connection to computer science, which I teach, web design, which I teach, and physics, which I teach sort of, at least through astronomy. And he's, one of my sort of folk hero. I'm definitely a fanboy of Tim Berners-Lee. I agree with his idea that the web should be semantic, which means that web content like you guys are going to be making should tell the browser, hey, this is supposed to be an article for a blog, and this is supposed to be a link to an email address. Even though the web content, HTML, the hypertext markup language, was started with semantics in mind, it really, during the browser war years, during the 80s and the 90s, no, there wouldn't be the 80s, it would be the 90s and the 2000s. The browser wars really caused HTML to sort of flail all over the place. And with HTML5, which we're going to talk about later, we're kind of back to the semantic web, which was Tim Berners-Lee's original idea with the way it was supposed to work. More about semantics later. I just want to talk a couple other things and then we'll be done here. The World Wide Web Consortium is the group that came out of those original web architects way back when. And much like the United Nations is meant to be sort of a everybody is served equally organization, that's what World Wide Web Consortium tries to be. It's not American, it's not European, it's not Asian, it's also not driven by any particular company or organization or government. And it kind of has its roots in the web is meant to be free, the web is meant to be used by everybody, the web should be a way for people to have access to information globally. And it's theoretically the group that is in charge of things like the language standards. And there's a lot of stuff here you can read. I just want to point out that they are in charge of all of these standards. So HTML is only one thing that they're working on. All these different components, all these different technical pieces. Very often, these individual things like HTML, the hypertext markup language, which is the original language Berners-Lee put together to run on a web page, it is governed by W3C, but in reality, there's a working group which has computer scientists and professors and people that work at companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft. So it's got everybody involved, and it's kind of driven by a whole lot of different things. It's not just the idea of being semantic information, but it's what Apple wants to do with the iPhone and what Microsoft would like the Xbox to do. So there's a lot of different sort of hands involved in developing these things. So we'll talk about HTML5 later, but I will say briefly here that HTML5, which is really still not technically even official, I made the choice to use it because it's got some great features that sort of simplify putting information together. And as information professionals, hopefully you guys will appreciate that. There's a lot here that I can get into, but it doesn't matter that much. There's a lot in the book about sort of what's important in terms of standards, so I'm not going to dwell on that. Speaking of the book, bruceontheloose.com/htmlcss, which I link to all over the website, so it doesn't much matter. He has on here, or he and she, the authors are Elizabeth Castro and Bruce Hyslop. They have put every single figure and every chunk of code on this site. And you are expected to, you are encouraged to come here when it's time to make, say, a page with images. Find the figure in the book that's closest to what you want to refer to and start with that code. Okay, I had to cut that one short. So there'll be another one coming up soon with more stuff.